So this growing antagonism toward the Iran-Assad/Shia axis is being used by Sunni clerics to gain power and legitimacy. So as Iran sees its military power diminishing, its great ally collapsing, and its religious authority being undermined, how is it responding to this? Before I answer in more specific terms, I'd like to just sort of place this in the context of Iran's foreign policy very generally over the last 30 years. As I mentioned, Iran has always aimed to be a regional superpower. But there have been times, particularly during the presidencies of Hashemi Rafsanjani and Mohammad Khatami, of a deviation from this much more ideologically driven foreign policy. Under Rafsanjani, we had the policy of economic pragmatism. Under Khatami, we had the policy of diplomatic inclusivity. So both of these presidents deviated from the kind of foreign policy agenda that we now see under Ahmadinejad and Khamenei. However, in 2005, with the presidential election and the victory of Ahmadinejad, this brought to the political culture of Iran a new generation of political elites who had served in the Iran-Iraq War. And this is what has changed the equation to some degree in terms of Iran's overall foreign policy. We see now that, to some degree, Iran has reverted back to this kind of revolutionary zeal that characterized the early days after the revolution. Militarily, Iran is driven by an ideological identity of fighting the so-called resistance, i.e. Israel. And this is very much part of Iran's identity today. And this is also how Iran has sold its support for Assad domestically, even though many Iranians, of course, are very critical of the fact that Iran is supporting the massacre in Syria. The way that Iran has packaged this domestically is that we have to support Syria because we have to continue to support the resistance, and we're the front line against the resistance. In order to carry out its support for Assad, Iran has not only, of course, supported the regime through the Revolutionary Guards, and this has included weapons and training. And it had been debated in the early days of the uprising whether or not Iran was intricately involved in Syria, but in fact, just last month, the commander of the Iran Revolutionary Guards officially confirmed Iran's involvement in assisting the Syrian government. It was the first public statement of Iran's involvement, and the commander, Major General Ali Jafari, said that the Al-Quds forces were operating not only in Syria but in Lebanon. The foreign ministry the next day tried to create more ambiguity to this statement and claimed that Jafari's statements were distorted by the media, but then other leaders within the regime admitted very openly that Iranian forces were present in Syria in an attempt, they said, to prevent further massacres. The Islamic Revolutionary Guards, and this is very important, have also assisted the regime with technical equipment to monitor email, Twitter, and YouTube. And let me just say that according to a lot of experts in technology, Iran is considered to be even more skilled than China at manipulating the internet. Iran sent in 2011 its own experts that had crushed the uprising in Iran in 2009 and 2010 to Syria simply in order to teach the Syrian officials and authorities how to monitor dissidents as they talked on their cell phones, as they communicated through social networking. And according to the Washington Post in May of 2011, a lot of Syrian dissidents and activists were actually arrested directly because of this assistance that Iran had given Syria. It's not surprising that the Revolutionary Guards in Iran are so intimately involved in the Syrian uprising. In doing so politically at home in Iran, this gives the Guards tremendous political power. And it also sends a message, not only to any potential for uprising domestically at home, but also it sends a signal, as far as the Guards are concerned, to the United States and to Gulf states that they will continue to support Assad at all costs. Iran believes it is justified in conducting this support for Syria because it believes, in terms of its own perception, that this is actually a proxy war that's going on in Syria. It's a proxy war considering that Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar are basically doing the dirty deeds of the United States, and this is how Iran views it. And this is why Iran is more determined than ever to triumph over what they have termed their so-called enemies. Just last week, in a meeting that the parliamentary speaker, Ali Larijani, had with the Syrian oil minister, he said that he even declared that the so-called enemies have been defeated. He said the era of imperialistic imposition by oppressive countries over independent nations is over. And he said that he framed the war in Syria as a triangle of foreign intervention, which includes Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey. And so you can see that how Iran sort of views this conflict on various levels. The last two more points I'd like to make is that Iran also sees itself, despite how distorted this may be to us sitting in the West, as having leverage in negotiating a compromise, a resolution to the conflict. According to a report that a think tank within the parliament in Iran produced just 2 weeks ago, Iran really believes that if it continues it continues its levels of support for Assad, as the previous speaker indicated, at some point in time there will have to be negotiations, and that Iran will be in a perfect position to be the mediator in these negotiations. The last point I would like to make is on the issue of sectarianism. And this is another very worrying development as a result of the Arab uprisings for Iran. Over the last 6 months, I've been conducting research in the region on this issue, and I can say that the Syrian civil war has sparked a historical conflict over Arab and Islamic identity that we have not seen for many decades. The atrocities being committed against the Sunnis in Syria have allowed the Sunnis, and particularly the Salafists, to create a narrative against all Shia. And this, of course, is done to advance their own causes in the various countries where they are now rising in power, both politically and religiously. But nonetheless, they are using the Syrian conflict to advance their own causes. And we see that the opinion of the Shia and Sunni has changed. In a startling poll published in August by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life, most countries surveyed in the Middle East and North Africa, in those countries, at least 40% of Sunnis indicated they do not even consider Shias as Muslims. In many cases, even greater percentages said some Shia practices were unacceptable in the Islamic tradition. In Egypt, for example, 53% said Shia are not Muslims. Therefore, even if Assad remains, Iran has already lost its ability to claim with any credibility, as Khamenei's statement indicated at the beginning of the uprisings at the opening of my remarks, as being the guardians for both Shia and Sunni. This possibility has passed. In fact, as the Syrian war rages on, we will see Iran more religiously and politically isolated in the region, and its goal of expanding its regional authority will become more complicated and more difficult to achieve. Thank you.
Geneive, thank you very much for bringing us this context about Iran's approach to the Syrian conflict. And you mentioned there the Sunnis and the Shias. And of course, in Lebanon, we have a large Shia community. Hezbollah is carrying on there, trying to defend its interests. It is also, of course, a Lebanese party, but it is also doing the bidding of Iran. So, Randa, we're waiting eagerly to hear your take on whether Lebanon is going to be dragged into this war, and how far will Hezbollah go to help Iran, or rather to help Assad, and whether they will want to jeopardize, whether Iran will want to jeopardize its foothold on the Mediterranean.
Thank you, Kim, and good afternoon, everybody. I have to be perfectly honest with you. I'm a little bit envious when I heard Amr and Shaban saying they have received these detailed emails from Kate asking them to address so many questions. My email from Kate was impact on Lebanon and Hezbollah. Period.
You could be here for hours.
Yeah. So I don't know if that means I have less than 13 minutes because I have this one question to address. But anyway, I'm going to proceed and talk about it. In terms of impacting Lebanon, as a given, Lebanon will be impacted. It doesn't take much for Lebanon to be impacted. Whatever happens in the region impacts Lebanon. Good or bad, it impacts Lebanon, and usually it's bad for Lebanon or for some Lebanese political parties. And as a Lebanese colleague and analyst, a friend of mine reminded me the other day, he said, the essence of being a Lebanese politician or political leader is to be a regional proxy. And so there is this fight next door going on, and it's going to be very hard for Lebanese political parties to resist the temptation to get into it. And they are into it, all of them, Sunni, Shias, all four shades and forms of Christian parties, Druze, everybody has a stake into the Syrian fight. The question is whether Lebanon will be able to weather this crisis without plunging into a wide-scale sectarian strife. And so far, we have not seen that kind of escalation happening, partly because all Lebanese parties, political parties, without exception, are aware that prospective losses from such escalation far outweigh the prospective gains. So when sectarian violence has occurred, as it has, and we have seen many episodes of it occurring recently, from Tripoli to Beirut to Sidon, usually we have seen all of these politicians rushing. That's like a confluence of interest among them in trying to contain it and limit it geographically and prevent its spread. Let me first talk a little bit about the impact on Lebanon writ large, and then the impact of Syria on Hezbollah and what Hezbollah is thinking of what's happening in Syria. In terms of impact on Lebanon, we can, there are three levels of impacts that we have seen so far. First is at the level of the Syrian refugee crisis. And it is a crisis. And it's a crisis that's happening in a state where its institutions, especially social service networks, are underfunded, understaffed, and where there is right now a lack of a political process where different agencies of the Lebanese government can come together and put together a strategic plan that they can advance to the international community for how to deal with the refugee crisis. The number, as recently registered in Lebanon, of registered refugees, Syrian registered refugees, is now 119,000, higher than the number in Turkey. And that's not the real total, because many of these refugees usually do not, register. There has been attempts pushed by the international community on the Lebanese government to get its act together, come up with a strategic plan that can be funded for how to deal with this crisis. And again, we are seeing, not much activity going on on that score. The main problem now facing the Lebanese government, as far as Syrian refugees is concerned, is shelter. Winter is coming, and there is a problem with shelter. The great majority of Syrian refugees have been basically taken in Lebanese homes by Lebanese families, especially in the north. I have seen even, Syrian families in the south, in Hezbollah strongholds. These are usually laborers who used to come and pick olives, during the season, and now they are back and they are hosted and housed by families there. There is a sensitivity for the Lebanese government to establish camps. They feel like, if they put camps for Syrian refugees, it's going to be a repeat of the Lebanon's experience with the Palestinian camps. And so we will be stuck with another diaspora that will not leave Lebanon and disrupt the dynamics inside the country. And this is now what they are trying to come up with, is how to provide shelter without having camps. Well, leave it to the Lebanese. They will be able to come up with some ideas about that.